My name is Caroline Bristow. I'm the Director of Cambridge School Classics Project, and this session is entitled Breaking Silence, Confronting Sexual Violence Through Classical Myths and Stories. The quote that's on the screen right now is from Nancy Sorkin-Rabinowitz, and she discusses what I think is kind of key to the pedagogical approach to things like sexual violence, which is the difference between managing difficult conversations and teaching difficult subjects. When we think of it as managing a difficult conversation, actually, we're not embracing the educational opportunity that is presented by this material, but also we're not, it can move very quickly into managing our students and their reactions. And actually that can feel very diminishing, especially if you are handling survivors of sexual violence in the room, which statistically speaking is highly likely. So before I get into this talk, obviously I want to give a content note due to the fact that obviously I am going to be discussing matters of sexual violence. We are going to cover things like rape myths and narratives. And I think it's important that people are aware of what is coming up. I want to start off talking about the role of stories and storytelling in human culture and how this relates to the way in which we make sense of our world, essentially. So Kahneman and Tversky are two Israeli psychologists who were working back in the 70s, and they came up with, well, essentially one of the first papers they did proved that even if you're a statistician, you don't think like a statistician, you think like a human. And once they had proven that all of us are thoroughly irrational, they went on to sort of try and work out, well, if we're not using rationality, what is it that we're using? And they talk about heuristics. They talk about how when we are making decisions, and this doesn't just mean a decision to act or not act, it can be a decision to believe or not believe, it can be a decision about whether you think something might happen or not. It's all of these kind of things. We are following heuristics. We are following rules of thumb, such as representativeness, which is basically how closely something resembles the model that's in our heads. We know what the world should look like, and we constantly judge our life experiences and what we experience against that model in our heads. And actually, we are far, far more likely to put credence on the model in our heads than the thing that's in front of us. So what I want to talk about is where do these come from? Well, many in varied places, but one of the most important explanations is stories. So if you haven't read it, I massively recommend Jonathan Gottschall's The Storytelling Animal. If you don't want to read the whole book, it is great though, do read it. Usefully, a guy called Jag Balla has written a blog post for Scientific American in which he essentially summarizes Gottschall's work into a really clear précis, which is really, really useful. I massively recommend reading it. But Balla and via Gottschall describes how every culture bathes their children in stories. And what stories are for in our culture is they're there to convey norms and values, and they are there to, in a way, create these heuristics. As children and as adults, you know, we are still susceptible to it as adults. We create stories, we create narrative, we absorb narrative. One of my favorite authors is Terry Pratchett. Pratchett plays with this massively in his fantasy novels, where he actually has in-jokes such as 1,000,000 to 1 chances happen 9 times out of 10. And if you, and frankly, if you believe in the story, it just happens. Everybody knows that the scullery maid marries the prince because that's just what happens. And actually, there's an entire book where the protagonist is trying to work against this and finding it incredibly difficult. Stories have a lot of power to shape our narratives. So that's how they're working as norms and values, but they also offer a massive opportunity. They're not just a tool for shaping how we think about the world, they're also a tool for exploring it. Stories, as it says on the right-hand side of the screen, offer feelings we don't have to pay full cost for. I love the idea of their simulated experiments in people physics. What stories enable us to do is explore and pull around very, very distressing sometimes, or very complex ideas in a safer space. They are one step removed from us. So rather than it happening to us or somebody we care about, we see it happening to a character. And whilst that can still be distressing and it can still be upsetting, it's not, it just gives us that slightly more remove in order for us to mentally cope with it. Moving on from the role of stories, I want to talk about the ideas of rape myths and survivor stories. At this point, I want to take a moment to actually position myself in relation to my material. I think it's incredibly important, and it's something I'm very comfortable with, and I've found that audiences tend to appreciate. So I speak on this as an ex-teacher. I also, while I was a teacher, spent a lot of time handling vulnerable students and taking disclosures, and I had a great interest in what we call safeguarding. But I also speak on this as a survivor of sexual violence. And so a lot of what I'm saying when I'm positioning myself, yes, sometimes I am speaking as a survivor, and I'm only one survivor. I am a walking anecdote, but I've tried to also ground myself in research. At the end of the day, experience does not give expertise, but just so people are aware where I am coming from with the material. So for starters, I want to talk about the concept of a rape myth. A rape myth is essentially a set of inaccurate yet irritatingly persistent beliefs about rape survivors and perpetrators. The list which is on the side of the screen is one example. There are loads and loads of different studies which have tried to categorize rape myths in different ways. Some very long lists, some very short ones, but at the end of the day, all of them kind of boil down to saying roughly the same thing with slightly different wording and slightly different subheadings. This is just one example list. As you read through it, you might actually be looking at it and thinking, yeah, these are ones I've heard of, or ones that actually you think, how is that a myth? Sometimes when I read these out to people, they're actually like, oh, that's a myth. Or you might be looking at it and thinking, who the hell is believing this? So we have the victims do something to ask for it, victims enjoy rape and assault, victims lie, it wasn't real rape. That's actually one you find quite often survivors themselves can struggle with. The perpetrator didn't mean to. Rape is a trivial act. And also one I actually think is really pervasive is rape is a deviant act associated with dangerous people and places. I.e. you should almost be able to spot somebody who's a perpetrator. Like they turn up with a sign around their neck or something. So just to show you this in action, I want to talk about what's the story. In 1991, German police officers were asked to describe a credible rape victim in scenario. Yes, this is an old study, this is an old piece of information. However, it's not a million miles away from what we see now in similar studies, and this is just a really nice snapshot to use. Nice. As we can see as we walk through this, there are rape myths inherent in this scenario. Victims are aged between 20 and 40, non-distinctive dress, attempt physical resistance, probably suffer injuries. She shows clear psychological distress. I'm fascinated as to what they think that looks like. There's no alcohol involved. The perpetrator is psychologically disturbed. There's a threat of physical violence, possibly involving a weapon. And the scenario is at night, outside, no witnesses, strangers. The reality is this is not what sexual assault looks like. The vast majority of sexual assaults are committed by perpetrators who know their victim within a safe environment. This is just not what it looks like. And you might be thinking, well, why is she going on about this? Well, basically, one of the problems of rape myths is the fact that victims, as Dr. Jessica Taylor says, victims are measuring themselves against rape myths and stereotypes to consider whether or not they will be believed. And one of the most horrendous things really to think about is that these rape myths don't just float around in society, but bounce off of survivors. They sit in us. And I find myself expressing them about my own issues. And it's actually quite striking. I am somebody who researches this, and yet sometimes if I'm speaking about my own situation, I will find them coming out of my mouth. And basically those heuristics are incredibly strong, and they also sit in survivors. So not only is it creating a culture in which perpetrators are not tackled, it's also creating a culture in which survivors feel elided, or they feel their experiences are coloured in a very damaging manner. And so the list on the side is a list taken from Jessica Taylor's book. And these are kind of her categorization of ways in which she's heard survivors essentially blame themselves. And you can probably see the link between these statements and the previous rape myths. For example, I shouldn't have been drinking. I shouldn't have led him on. I shouldn't have gone to that place or met that person. These are all tapping into the other side of those narratives we were looking at. What this actually leads to, if we're talking about children, is issues of disclosure. Well, not just with children. The vast majority of adult survivors don't disclose either, but when it comes to child abuse, this is even more prominent. Often survivors of child abuse will delay disclosure for a significant period of time, which correlates to how young they were when abuse took place. I believe the average length of time between offence and disclosure is actually around 30 years. So basically, this is why things like statutes of limitations can be deeply problematic. This is due to a lot of factors. Developmental, for example, often children do not realise what's happening to them. They might know something is not right, but they don't possess the vocabulary to vocalise. And basically, these are issues where children can express that they're not comfortable, but they can't tell an adult what's happening because they just don't have the words. There are also feelings of shame, guilt, or embarrassment, which act as frequent barriers, and these will be played upon and enhanced by abusers. These are two case studies taken from an NSPCC, which is the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children here in the UK. They did a fantastic study that I've actually linked to earlier in the slide, which actually looked at qualitative data about child abuse victims. And these are two that stood out to me. The areas that I've highlighted are areas where you can see these issues of disclosure being reflected in the words of the child. These people are now older and they understand what happened to them, but you can see how as children, they did not understand this. The way I've put it before is, unfortunately with children, if they are abused, they're calibrated by an abuser. They're normalized. The heuristic in their head has been set by somebody who is abusing their trust or is pushing them in a direction. They are normalized in a very destructive way. And this is something that should be tackled, otherwise they will not disclose and they actually won't seek help for themselves. So this brings me to your classroom. The reason it's taken me this long to get to your classroom is I really wanted to centre this in the context of how this works in society. And I want to kind of actually advocate for an approach to studying narratives of sexual violence, which is a little bit more complex than maybe it's sometimes depicted. So everybody tends to focus on this. They tend to focus on access, which is brilliant. We want all students to access our material at the end of the day. So we think about, can somebody who has an adverse reaction to a story involving sexual violence access my classroom and succeed? And we want that answer to be yes, of course we do. But often this is kind of where we stop. We stop by, okay, the survivor in my classroom feels safe, they feel valued, they feel that they can speak. Brilliant, they're accessing the material, they're a success. But actually, I think this is missing an opportunity. I would like to advocate for actually using that material to address some of the things that I've just been talking about. So let's think about enabling young people to recognise abuse and unhealthy or dangerous relationships for themselves and others. Let's think about providing students with vocabulary and structures to express experience and feelings. And finally, let's think about overcoming feelings of shame, guilt, or embarrassment and reinforcing a notion of life after abuse. Because actually, it's all very well for them to feel not actively upset in your classroom, but let's actually see if we can attempt an area of actually them not feeling disempowered at all. This is something that's incredibly difficult. The traumatized brain is a phenomenally complex and very highly individualized thing. No two survivors will have the same reaction to things. Trauma responses are many and varied. And trauma-informed teaching is not something that I can cover in a half-hour talk. So what I'm going to do is do a few bits and pieces and try and explain a few principles. There'll be resourcing available for you to read things that I think are interesting, but I cannot stress enough how much I think it's important to handle those of us with trauma in a way that kind of recognizes that our brains, they're just working a little bit differently. And I think something that I say to pretty much all teachers that I work with is, you may not be able to avoid a trauma survivor getting upset by material. That's really upsetting because you want your student to be okay. And this, unfortunately, isn't always possible, especially if something's still very raw or you touch a nerve. One thing that I would say every teacher needs to understand is that you need to forgive yourself if that happens. You cannot beat yourself up about it. There is blame attached to that person's pain, but it does not belong to you, and it certainly does not belong to the student. It belongs to the perpetrator. So as long as you are doing your best to actually support and be a voice of positivity in that student's life, then you need to also be able to forgive yourself when you cannot reach them in the way that you wish you could. So I take this quote from Talking Rape in the Classroom by Sharon L. James. Generally, I think this is a really interesting article, but I really zeroed in on this particular paragraph. She comments on what I've been raising, which is the process of analysing patterns of rape in, say, Ovid, Greek myth, New Comedy, seems to offer them a chance to think about cultural values, social practices, and the persistence of rape throughout history. This is brilliant. This is exactly what I'm talking about, is the idea of using this material to really interrogate the prevalence of sexual violence throughout history and the cultural norms that lead to this. Where I take a little bit more issue is actually the second paragraph. I've heard often from students that these materials make them more aware of their own vulnerability to rape and cause them to take more precautions. Now, this is fine. This is, you know, if her students are more aware of their own vulnerability, kind of, except is that what we want our students to be taking away from a study of sexual violence in the classroom? You might be sitting there thinking, well, of course, we want them to be safe, but actually, let's think about this. What we're talking about, what these students seem to be taking away is, I could be vulnerable, I need to change my behaviour, I should be scared. There are alternative narratives that you could be promoting in your classroom. Personally, I would prefer to see one of these. I would prefer to see that students are more aware of the harm rape does and what constitutes sexual violence. You'd be astonished how many students actually don't really understand what is sexual violence. More aware of the range of responses victims may have. This is so important. The amount of issues in the criminal justice system where victims are not responding as you'd expect. A clinical psychiatrist will look at how they're responding and say, well, yeah, they are. That's a trauma response. But in society, we think of a trauma response in a certain way. And so actually helping people to feel that their traumatized minds are acceptable and rational and normal is incredibly powerful. Frankly, less likely to commit acts of violence. Statistically speaking, you will have perpetrators in your classrooms. They don't spring out of nowhere. And so actually, let's think about whether we can actually educate these people so that they don't make dreadful choices. Less likely to blame themselves, that would be nice, and more likely to disclose acts of violence, which is incredibly important. So how do we go about this? What should the story be? Again, I'm going back to Jessica Taylor. I do love her. She's great. Follow her on Twitter. She is a radical feminist, which is why she speaks exclusively of female victims. Obviously, this is true of female, male, non-binary, anyone who's a victim of sexual violence. And these hold true. Essentially, what messages should we be sending survivors about their mindsets? Your trauma is normal. when we say your trauma, what we don't mean is like it's normal that you were assaulted. It's your trauma response, your trauma, the wiring it has caused in your mind. Your trauma is normal. Your trauma is justified. Your trauma is proportionate, and your trauma is rational. Basically, survivors are often told that their responses are disproportionate. It happened years ago. It's irrational. That makes no sense. You don't deserve to feel like that. And it minimizes those reactions. And the more you crush and minimize those reactions, the harder they are to sit with and work with, and the more harm is caused. So actually, whenever you're dealing with narratives of sexual violence, think about, how am I talking about this? Am I using words and language that make the victim's response seem disproportionate, irrational? Am I referring to Artemis and the Actaeon myth as mad and overreacting? I have a lot of feelings about that myth, which I do not have time to go into here. Maybe I'll write a blog post. Language matters. Language, for better or worse, shapes the process. Essentially, you're probably a Latin teacher watching this. You know language matters. And so I just want to highlight a few things that you could actually be thinking about when you're talking. So for starters, people become victims of violence with no mention of a perpetrator. It's like they're just walking down the road and suddenly, like, Zeus literally, well, actually, no, not Zeus, bad choice. But essentially, like, just magically, they become a victim of violence. And it's like, no, they have violence perpetrated against them. So just think about, and actually you see this in official statistics, you see this in studies. 1 in 5, this is a genuine study, 59% of girls in UK schools will become victims of sexual violence. Literally a statistic I've read in a government report. I was like, will they? Just by magic? Avoid rapist seduction. This is something that I think people feel more comfortable with because it reduces the violence level and makes it consensual. I mean, for starters, that's incredibly difficult. And actually, if students encounter more than one version of a text and they realise, and also, students aren't stupid. They know it's rape. And if you start trying to like pass it off as seduction, that's muddying that message really quite badly. And also, speaking as a survivor, I end up feeling elided because actually there are myths, you know, we're there and we're here. And actually eliding us by making our experiences something that's just not talked about, I already feel not socially acceptable, and I'm 34 years old. I don't really want a child in a classroom feeling that. Rape elided, exactly what I've been saying. Don't miss it out. Don't kind of do the thing that, you know, early 90s TV shows used to do when people used to go to bed and then the screen would just cut away to like a standard lamp in the corner. Don't do that in your class, the equivalent of that in your classroom. You know, accept it's there, address it, be sensitive, but don't hide it. Don't focus on the standard lamp. Victims should never be described as mad, damaged, diminished, broken. Obviously, again, probably if you're watching this, you have looked at or used the CLC. The CLC has a story in it of Euphrosyne. Euphrosyne has a kiss forced upon her at a dinner party. And I had somebody at an event once say, it's such a shame that such a strong female character is diminished in that way. Is she? Is she diminished? Not comfortable with that at all. And also avoid perpetrators who are overcome by lust, beauty, and love, basically giving them reasons why it's, you know, oh, they didn't mean to, it just sort of happened. Stories enable safer exploration, so keep your distance. Avoid lines of questioning which ask students to inhabit characters. What might X be feeling? Why did X do this? Is X's reaction justified? Are X's actions understandable? Avoid things where you're asking them to talk about how it might feel to be a perpetrator or victim of sexual violence and whether the actions can be justified or understood. Equally, first-person writing tasks, a little bit difficult. Alternatives. What does the author reveal? Keep it in terms of the text and the story. Explain why something is an act of sexual violence. Write a news report or a witness account of the incident. Well, that can be a little close to the bone for some people. What can be very, very useful is a free writing exercise where students get to choose their level of engagement, and also can be really interesting for you as a teacher to actually see what they're taking away from the lesson. What are the power dynamics at play? How does this impact on consent? Let's talk about trauma responses. What is this character displaying? Keep it in terms of characters. You know, this character is doing this thing. You know, why is that happening? Are you aware that sometimes people who have been traumatized do this? What is that something we're seeing here? Is Artemis's blind rage at turning Actaeon into a stag actually a representation of the rage that often sexual violence survivors do have within them? And yes, I have feelings on that myth. To finish off, I want to actually talk about the CLC, and I want to talk about stage 38, which some of you may use, some of you may not. For those of you who do not, very quick précis. Essentially, the emperor decides to adopt, essentially, reasonably young girl gets married off to an old guy against her will. She's not happy about it. We see the wedding ceremony. That's a very quick précis. So before starting this stage, I would actually think about the following. A content note. Trigger warnings have become this really oddly debated thing. Frankly, just tell people what they're about to see. Traumatic content shouldn't pop up out of nowhere and like, ugh! You know, generally, if you offer a warning or a summary to your students, if you have someone in the room who might find it difficult, they can actually prepare their minds and actually get themselves thinking. Challenge and discuss attitudes towards women. Do not just breeze through this at speed because it's a bit worrying and a bit sensitive. Actually think about challenging and discussion, and also use it to highlight important issues of forced marriage and other abuses in today's society. Forced marriage is still a thing. It is illegal in some US states, not all. And it's illegal in the UK. And it is something that students can actually learn about and learn about their own world. Terminology is phenomenally important. I'm really, really keen on people using the right words for things. So in this case, forced and arranged marriage are completely different. I would actually spend some time exploring that. Legal position in the modern world and the age of consent, making sure students understand those things for their world. And also the power dynamics and sexual assault. There are a few places where I feel that there are conversations that could be had around whether Paula, the young woman's consent, can really truly be called consent. And finally, resources and safety. I would always advise people to make available organisations that deal with these matters. Maybe Childline is a good one to highlight to them. Resources available if they're worried about their own or someone else's safety, and also try to create a sense that talking to a trusted adult about this is actually a really good idea, because the more we don't talk about these abuses in our society, the more they will keep going on. So I want to go through some of these stories. I'm not going to like dwell on each of them. You can see my PowerPoint, which is quite helpful, but I want to try to give you some highlights, some ways in which I would say you can, with each of these stories, highlight different things, work with different things, and actually use them to bring out some of these issues. So we start off with a story in which the emperor and the young lady and Paula's father are discussing her being married off. For starters, we have an absence of the female voice. And I would actually be talking about, what does this tell us about the Roman view of women and marriage? How do the students feel about this? Not what would it feel like to be the girl, but how do the students who are reading this story feel about it? Are there modern or historic parallels they can draw? We then move on to Paula. This story was previously marked as one, because in the teacher's guide, some of you may be aware, there are little asterisks next to stories that can be skipped. This one used to be a story that can be skipped. I've actually taken those away because I think that you kind of have to have Paula's views and voice straight after those male voices before her. I would advise giving a précis summary of this before reading it, because we are hearing Paula's distress and her reasons for not wanting to marry Sparsus. And I'd also actually use this as, in discussion of arranged marriage, ensure that students avoid stereotypical responses. Students who don't come from cultures where arranged marriages are a thing will often see an arranged marriage as abuse. it's not. For a lot of cultures, it's just a norm, and they're perfectly fine. It's forced marriage that is problematic. So possibly have that conversation about what is the difference between these two things, and what's happening to Paula. Is this, and I'm sure that, you know, in Roman society, arranged marriage is a thing, but there is a very interesting, the woman's consent is supposed to be sought. You know, where is that line between forced and arranged, and which one is Paula facing? Moving on, Paula meets her boyfriend in a garden, because of course she does, because Roman texts, and they have a very deep, meaningful conversation where he wants to save her from her marriage, and she's like, no, I can't do that because of my family and duty and things like that. I think this is a brilliant story for exploring consent. Technically, Paula is consenting to her marriage. It is not forced, she is consenting. However, when we start looking at this issue of family values, family pressure, societal pressure, power dynamics, can this actually be called consent? Have this conversation with your students. Is Paula actually in agreement with this marriage? Can we really say that she has agency? And also, this is a very good opportunity to challenge an idea in our modern world that family honour, loyalty, or a sense of duty are reasons to accept or perpetrate harm. Again, you may want to make resources around honour-based violence available to students, or make sure they know where to go if they are worried about someone. This is a very real issue. Abuses are often, survivors and victims are often kept silent by an idea of duty, loyalty. And actually, we do need to be unpicking that idea that duty to someone allows them to perpetrate harm to you. We then move on to the stories that actually I think could be the most distressing in this stage for a survivor, which are the marriage. Paula is openly weeping throughout, and we also have the delightful Roman ceremony of Paula being torn away from her family by the enslaved women and dragged to a house where she will inevitably consummate her marriage. It's not done gratuitously, but it's a pretty accurate depiction of a Roman wedding ceremony. I would give a précis summary before reading this. The content could be a shock, and but also don't elide Paula's situation. This is reality for a lot of women in the ancient world who may have been openly distressed at their own marriage. Avoid asking how might it feel to be in Paula's position, because just don't ask that. Instead, let's think about what features of the narrative tell us about Paula's feelings and character. So you're upskilling literary analysis, which is awesome, but you're also just avoiding them and doing that inhabiting. How do students react to her treatment? Keep questions like this quite voluntary. If you've got a survivor in the room, they might actually be coping with listening to you and engaging in that very passive way. If you direct a question at them, they might not be able to cope. So questions where you're getting quite close to the bone, I'd say actually keep them voluntary and allow a level of participation that suits students. Also, what attitudes are revealed by the Roman wedding ceremony? Attitudes to female chastity, attitudes to a woman's approach to sexuality. What attitudes are being revealed here, and what damage could they be doing? What violence and harm are they perpetrating or empowering? These are all conversations that are incredibly important, and they enable us to use this really upsetting story and the reality of these women's lives to actually explore things which are directly relevant to students today. And finally, I would actually have a good conversation about the aftermath. This is the last we hear of these characters, Sparsus, the husband, Paula, the wife, and Helvidius, her boyfriend. And our students, what do you think happens to them? Give Paula's voice the centrality and weight it lacked in the stories and the society that it depicted. Think about her. Don't ask what she might think. Focus on her survival. Her life didn't end. She will have coped, because that's what women like her did. There have been millions of women like Paula for years, for centuries, for millennia. They coped. they survived. And actually, that's what you should be enforcing with students. It's not a case of an act of violence is perpetrated and your life is over. There is life after abuse. And that is actually an empowering message that students and survivors can take. A useful exercise here as well, I think, is free writing. I think this is a really good stage for using free writing. It enables engagement in line with student comfort, provides a creative outlet to explore complex feelings, and it can be really instructive for you as a teacher. So Sharon James's article where she's like, oh, students seem to be thinking to themselves about keeping themselves safe. Okay, how will you find that out? Think about free writing. Take them in. You might want to have them submitted anonymously. That's completely fine. Students might be more honest. But actually read them and think about what heuristics are your students taking? What messages have they taken from your teaching? What messages have they taken from these stories? And actually that can be really instructive for you as a reflective practitioner and in structuring your lessons and thinking about how you approach things. And finally, I want to end on a picture of a bowl, because of course I do. This is actually a broken bowl, which has been repaired with lacquer full of gold leaf. It's a Japanese art called kintsugi. Apologies to anyone who, if I've just pronounced that incorrectly. Kintsugi is beautiful. It's one of my favorite things. And it's kind of how I think about acts of violence in many ways. Restoring agency to women doesn't happen when you deny them their victimhood. They need to rise above it and become survivors in our teaching, and that enables it in our students. You can never take away a break that is caused by sexual violence. It will never go. What it can do is be healed with gold, and it can form a part of a beautiful, successful human being. And that is what we want survivors to take away from our classroom and from the study of sexual violence narratives. We don't want them to feel diminished. We don't want them to feel elided, and we definitely want them to feel that they have a place in our classrooms.